Hi, we enter into Luke 19 today in the wonderful story unique to Luke of Zacchaeus, the chief tax collector, who's rich and climbs up a tree to see Jesus. So as you can see on the right side of the screen, there's our passage unique to Luke, and as we're going to see in two videos, this passage summarizes really and brings to fruition all of the entire travel narrative. It's the last encounter in the travel narrative, as well as Jesus' entire public ministry, because after this, Jesus will tell a parable that points him toward Jerusalem, and then they'll be preparing for the entry, and then he'll be in Jerusalem. So this story culminates the whole reality of it, and we can see from the chiasm that we've been following here, we're almost at the very end here as we go up the right side of the screen, parallel to what we saw in the beginning of it, the call of various disciples and the 70 there. And although he's not, the blind person who's healed is not named Bartimaeus in Luke, we saw how the story of the blind person of Zacchaeus are responses to the original call. And that's one of the elements we've been looking at. And if you haven't watched the introduction to this whole unit of 1711 to 1948, I really encourage you to do so, where we go over a number of the issues that can lead to bad interpretations. And one of them is the failure that among these faulty interpretations is that passages are read on their own rather than parallel with their chiastic partners. And we've been looking at that all the way through. Here, the chiastic partner, as I was noting, was the invitation to discipleship, where back in chapter 9, three different people were told things that made it difficult for them to follow. But here we have people at the bottom of the social scale, a blind beggar and a tax collector who is up a tree, and they both are positive expressions here. And yet they're positive expressions in the face of the theme of this whole unit we've been looking at, is that Jesus needs to prepare the disciples for Jesus' own and for their own rejection. So throughout this unit, we've seen color coordinated here for who's doing the rejection, how each scene carries some element of rejection. And here, it brings together a theme we've seen throughout the entire story, that all, not just the Pharisees and the scribes who grumbled in chapter 15 at the same reality, but all grumble about Jesus being Zacchaeus' house guest. And we're going to see a number of ways in which our story here intratextually connects to other parts of Luke. So we'll be looking at that along the way. Looking back at the key words that I just showed you, I didn't do a keywords for the whole chapter, because our chapter, as I was just noting, consists of three very different units. And the chapters are not part of the original construction. They were put in the medieval era to help scribes keep track of where they were. So Luke didn't have them as chapters. What we have here is this story on the right side of the screen, which I was just noting, is almost at the end of the travel narrative. But after this in the travel narrative is the story here about the preparation for Jerusalem, about what happens when a powerful man gives money to others to make more money for him, and one refuses to participate in it. So that'll be a warning of what happens when they get to Jerusalem. So this story here, though, is structured in its own interesting way, as you can see, not chiastically. The beginning and the end don't meet, and it's not exactly parallel panels in the sense of a first half and a second half that are parallel. But as you can see on the chart on the right side of the screen, a whole series of word pairs. These are words that are not uniquely in this passage. Most of them, in fact, all of them except the tree and the defrauded, are elsewhere in Luke. But they're uniquely paired here, and that's to bring attention to the first half, and at least the first part and the second part, in ways that are not often easy to see in the English. For example, obviously, the fact that this tree is called a sycamore, and the writing says, "I have defrauded," would not lead any English readers to catch the connection between the word sycomoria and sycophanteo here, which is literally a fig informer, from which we get the English word sycophant, but we'll get to that next video. So another aspect of what makes our story so exciting is we have a named character, Zacchaeus, and there aren't that many named characters in Luke. This list makes it look like it's long, but it's really not that many when you consider that all of these are in the infancy narratives, and they include Zechariah and Elizabeth. I'm sorry, I didn't mark this one here, but that one too. I'll fix it before I post it at radicalbible.net. Elizabeth and Zechariah and John the Baptist and Mary, and of course then Jesus, and then John and Jesus are actually named what the angel tells them to name them, and Simeon. So all those are in the first two chapters. But the next named person is a tax collector named Levi, who is at his tax booth and follows, and then has a big banquet with a bunch of tax collectors, and as we'll see in a minute, leading people to grumble that he's eating with tax collectors. In chapter 8, we hear that the demon that possesses the man in Gerasa is called Legion, a reference to the Roman Empire, its military force, Legion. In chapter 8, we saw that there was a synagogue leader named Jairus whose daughter was sick, and he was paired, as you might recall, with the bleeding woman. It's interesting. It's a rare occasion where the person of status is named and the person of low status is not. In contrast with in chapter 16, where the rich man is not named and the poor man at his gate, Lazarus, is. Here in chapter 10, Martha is named, a woman named Martha, and Mary is there too, but she's not named in that, using that same word anima here, which is the key. I just used the Greek word anima. So I didn't mention Simon Peter or John or others, who the narrator doesn't describe as named. It just gives their name. Then we have Zacchaeus, a second tax collector, and then we'll see near the very end, after Jesus is dead, a good and righteous man named Joseph, called Joseph of Arimathea in the other Gospels, and then on the road to Emmaus, Cleopas, and we don't hear who Cleopas' partner's name is. So often we see this pattern of one character among many named to draw some attention, although it's not always clear what the attention is, what the reason for one named character, like why Cleopas but not Cleopas' partner, why Jairus but not the other woman, etc. But we're going to focus obviously on Zacchaeus here, and I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but the name Zacchaeus is the Grecicized form of the Hebrew Zacchae, meaning clean or innocent. And it's interestingly parallel to Zechariah at the beginning, and we'll look more about that as we get into verse 2, so we'll see that as we go. So also while we're on verse 2, and I'll go back to verse 1, plainly we know right from the beginning that not only is Zacchaeus a tax collector, but he's an arche-telonos, a chief tax collector, and he's rich, and so he's connected with the rich man who walked away sad, who told Jesus that he kept all the commandments. So we see someone who's trying to justify himself in that previous passage and walks away sad when Jesus tells him what he lacks is what he would gain from giving away his possessions and following Jesus. We have that contrasted with the rich tax collector who will happily give away a lot, but we'll see that next time. And so while I'm focused on tax collectors, let's see how Zacchaeus here at the end, the last tax collector noted, falls into both categories, tax collectors and sinners here. And so as you can see, the green is tax collectors and the red is sinners. And so let's just go through this briefly, because it starts with tax collectors who came to be baptized, and they asked, "Teacher, what should we do?" And in many ways, what Zacchaeus does, that we'll see in next video, is a response to exactly this. So really, the arc of this narrative here is not just within the travel narrative, but all the way from 3:12 to chapter 19 here, all the way from John the Baptist to the end of Jesus' public ministry to try to gather people to follow. And the very next story is a tax collector named Levi that I just mentioned. And then Levi gives his great banquet, and we see there the Pharisees and their scribes were complaining or grumbling, "Why do you eat and drink with tax collectors and sinners?" And Jesus explains that he's come for the sick, not the well, and yet we'll see this over and over again. So let's just jump down here. Notice in chapter 7 the accusation against the human one in contrast to John the Baptist, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. Then in chapter 15, we hear all the tax collectors and sinners were coming near to listen to him. Does that include Zacchaeus? It says all. And the Pharisees and the scribes, notice not their scribes that we saw earlier, but the same reality. The Pharisees and the scribes were grumbling for the same thing. He welcomes sinners and eats with them. And notice they haven't learned anything or haven't changed their position. We heard the exact same thing here. They asked there and Jesus gave an answer, but they apparently don't like his answer and they're grumbling about it now. And interestingly, it's followed by a parable in chapter 18 with not real people, but within the parable, a Pharisee and a tax collector who describes himself as a sinner. So notice that otherwise tax collector and sinner were separate categories, such as tax collectors and sinners, multiple times as we see. But this tax collector acknowledges before God he's a sinner, and in the parable Jesus says this man went home justified, in contrast to the person who stood off the Pharisee. And now we get to Zacchaeus, and although the language of justification isn't in our passage, the language of salvation is, and yet now it's not just the Pharisees and either their scribes or the scribes, but all who grumble. So the building up of rejection of Jesus as he goes continues, and the people have not experienced metanoia. They do not have a changed mind or heart such that they could embrace the inclusion of these outcasts, or at least marginalized people, but hence the hardening that will lead to the crucifixion momentarily. And then finally, for sinners here in the road to Emmaus, where we hear the human one must be handed over to sinners, be crucified on the third day, and rise. And so all of those elements are part of what is being brought together in our story here. So let's go back to the beginning of it, and I'll put the shape of it of our passage up here as we walk through our story. So he entered Jericho. And as I was noting last time, I made a mistake before the previous video where it also said he was approaching Jericho, whether it was ambiguous whether it was Jesus or somebody else, but there it was plainly Jesus. But here it is ambiguous of whether it's the blind person who, as we last saw, praise God, he entered Jericho. So it could be Jesus or it could be the blind person. As Yamasaki notes below, he argues for a point of view analysis, saying that we're being led by the narrator to see this through the point of view of a character, and there's an ambiguity in verse 1 that's resolved in verse 2 when we find out that it's Zacchaeus. So we looked at Jericho last time and the connection with the story of Bartimaeus from Mark, but this story is unique. So we saw last time how Mark had the story of Bartimaeus as they were leaving Jericho, but Luke has extended the time in Jericho for this purpose. So he entered Jericho and was passing through it, and diarchomai here will be echoed here in what we see in Zacchaeus' head down there. And so now we get what's always left out for some reason in the translation, kaidu, and behold. And so, and that also, I don't have that pair on here because it's not in the New RSV translation, which I put up here. But I'll correct that before I post it too, to connect the Zacchaeus' kai idu, or at least idu in verse 8, with the narrators at the beginning here. So there was a man, and I highlighted this in particular because it uses the male term aner. It's not anthropos, a generic for a human being. And although it's 27 times in Luke, it's specific here and echoes in a place where it's hidden by the translation. I did correct that one to be guest of a man who is a sinner. I don't think it's highlighting the gender as such, although as far as we know, tax collectors are all male. But you can make what you want out of the humiliation as a man as opposed to a woman in doing what he does and how he's described as we go. So I was noting already that he was named, and this is a rare double combination. Automati Kalomenos, his name was called, or there's called his name, Zacchaeus, and as I noted, the meaning of that. And so let's go back down here to this note to see some of the further connections. So as we saw at the very beginning, Zechariah is a holy priest and links with the Anawim, the holy poor, throughout the Hebrew Bible, whereas Zacchaeus is a sinful chief tax collector and rich. But both are children of Abraham looking for salvation. If we recall, Zechariah was awaiting the visitation of God and the liberation that would come from that, not so much because he saw himself as a sinner, but he saw Israel as captive to empire or to evil, and therefore framed the story. From Z to Z, from Zechariah to Zacchaeus. Biamungu, writing from an African context, writes, there's an unfair dichotomy in Zacchaeus between his public image and his real name, which means innocent. As it were, he will fit the image of a child who is anxious to go to Jesus but is walled off, of a blind person who is looking for a grace of vision but is hindered from expressing his need to the one who has the capacity to grant it to him. And that's a lovely comment, I think, seeing it from the perspective of a community of the poor who were not like Zacchaeus, but like Zacchaeus' victims of extraction of their wealth by the elite. And so chief tax collector only here in the New Testament, and not in previous Greek literature, according to Fitzmyer. Notice it's not it's not the. So as chief, it would suggest he's the only one, but we see the same prefix, arche, about the chief priests, and plainly they're plural, so it's a category. So even though you might think there's one chief, there's a category of leading tax collectors, and yet we don't know much about that. As you can note below from Veros, from an article, he notes the many parallels with Levi, the context of a journey, although it's not on the journey to Jerusalem, but Jesus was on his journey when he found Levi at the tax booth. He's named. It's Jesus' initiative. There's a feast made for Jesus in the tax collector's house. There's a criticism of Jesus from Jesus' adversaries, and there's a defense of Jesus. So one of the many ways we're expected to look at this story back to the Levi story, among many other connections, as we'll see. And we've already seen many rich people, but it's worth going back to see how Zacchaeus fits in with the whole sequence of rich people we've seen. So most immediately he's connected with the person, the ruler we saw in chapter 18. But he's also connected with the rich man and Lazarus back here, and we can imagine as a chief tax collector who's rich, he could also dress in those kinds of clothes and feast sumptuously. It's a possibility. We saw the rich man who had the manager, and the focus there was on the manager, not on the rich man himself. But we saw earlier the land of the rich man producing abundantly, and what a fool Jesus says God calls him for thinking it's about him and not being prepared for the reality, which is to say to share what he had and to not recognize that the land's production was not his work but the Creator's work. And then, of course, in chapter 14 we saw the whole theme of who you invite to banquets and meals, not your rich neighbors who can repay you in the reciprocity code, but the poor, the blind, the lame, etc. So starting with the Sermon on the Plain, where Luke has the series of woes, and woe to you who are rich, you've received your consolation. So that frames it all the way up to what we'll see when he gets to Jerusalem, rich people putting their gifts into the treasury, and that will connect with the widows we've seen earlier. So we'll still see more connections with what we've seen before, but that's the main connection with rich people we see here. So we've seen Zacchaeus is connected with rich people, we've seen him connected with tax collectors, we've seen him connected with other named characters, and now we find out something about what he's about. These are just static characterizations. And notice that's more than we hear about almost anybody else. We know his name, his occupation, and his material status. But we're going to find out more about him right here. As Yamasaki continues, notes the shift with this verse to Zacchaeus' point of view, which remains throughout. As a result of not shifting point of view back to Jesus, he says, quote, the audience experiences Jesus' words of salvation directed toward them as they look out at Jesus as though through the eyes of Zacchaeus. A nice insight there. So he was trying to see or seeking who Jesus was, and there's a couple of ambiguities we need to look at there. So seeking or see, is it literally a question of his eyes? So he's like the blind beggar that he can't see? Or is he seeking like it's an inquiry? And is it a matter of who Jesus is, or what he is, in the sense of is it Jesus or what Jesus is about? And Kanunda, writing from the work with a small Christian community in Tanzania, notes that his group imagines Zacchaeus coming to Jesus, quote, wanting to see and compare who between them was the richest. Some opined that he pretended to seek Jesus, when in fact his real motive was to ascertain if some people in the crowd carried things that were subject to tax. So that's their rather cynical view out of their own experience, that there couldn't really be a tax collector who wants to see Jesus. It must just be a pretense to be spying on them. So he wants to see who Jesus was. Is that a matter of who do you say that I am? And the answer is the Messiah or the human one or the Holy One of God or whatever it might be. But we don't know the details of what's on his mind. But then we hear this interesting element. But on account of the crowd, he could not, or was not powerful enough, dunamai here. It's not that the crowd is blocking him, it's that somehow he's not powerful enough, bringing up the contrast we saw in the story of the rich man who walks away sad, that God is powerful enough even when humans aren't powerful enough, and that certainly echoes into our story here. And then there's a lovely ambiguity in the word here, helikia here, for stature. As Green noted a number of years ago, there are a number of possibilities for what it means. Shortness of age, that he's young, or shortness of height, but it could also be shortness of social status, that as a tax collector, people look down on him. In other words, it's not necessarily about his physical stance or his age, but how he's perceived. And those don't have to be mutually exclusive, although one would be a symbol of the other. His physical shortness would be a symbol of how people look down on him socially. As Green continues, he notes that the imagery of going up and down the tree, quote, serves as a metaphor associated with matters of status honor. And as Sick adds in a recent article, that hurrying and climbing a tree would make him an object of mockery for the Roman elite audience. But we're not quite there yet. We will be there now. And so if we're seeing this from Zacchaeus' standpoint, we recognize that we're hearing that he has a desire to see Jesus, but the crowd is somehow in the way. But there's no way anybody, especially Luke's audience, would imagine that what happens is here. As Kununda notes from his 2019 article, from the same context of the small Christian community, that this is Zacchaeus' desire to look down on them, which is ironic since he's short, people would tend to be looking down on him on the ground. So he ran ahead, and the running is plainly inappropriate, but it fits not with the same language, but it fits the language of the father of the prodigal son back in chapter 15, who runs out to greet his son, even though that word, as we can see, is not used in, the running is not used in chapter 15, and prosthon is the word for ahead, so we see ahead a number of times. But the running is only here, and plainly adults in that world did not run. They didn't jog, they didn't run for fun. Running was something that kids did. Similarly with climbing a tree, or on a bino literally went up a tree. And now we have to explore the many possibilities of what this tree is. It's simply described as a sycamore tree, but we really need to look at the fact that there's many possibilities. So there are three named trees in Luke. The fig tree, Suke, which is the main tree, as you can see, is named as fig tree throughout the other Gospels. Whether when they get to Jerusalem in Mark, where the fig tree is cursed by Jesus, and when they leave Jerusalem it's withered. Matthew has that all in one scene. John, the fig tree, is where Jesus finds Nathanael, representing a sacred image of God being present in the fig tree, and the vine and fig tree, and as we already looked at in chapter 13 in Luke back here, a fig tree in a vineyard. And then on Revelation we see like the leaves of a fig tree shaken. But what we see earlier in chapter 17, verse 17:6 in Luke, is what is at least botanically a fig mulberry tree, a sucamino, and here in 19:4 is a sucamorion, described as a sycamore tree. But there's a real question of the species of these, and we can't answer them all. As Sick notes on the left side here, he suggests it could either be an Egyptian fig or a mulberry. In either case, he says, quote, "These trees produce a messy fruit with a red or purple hue when ripe, the colors of nobility in both the Greco-Roman and Near Eastern context." And he continues, "The audience might imagine a pretentious official hurrying up and down a tree laden with fruit, staining his clothes or skin." But what's important to note here, as in contrast with the delicious figs here, neither the fruit of the sucamino or of the sucamorion are edible by humans. And I want to distinguish this, so I didn't put it up here, from the ordinary mulberry tree, which has berries, long berries like long, narrow blackberries. But clearly edible berries, maybe you have mulberries around you. That's a different thing. And in terms of species, there are many, many different species of Middle Eastern sweet figs. So this is just the red fig, but there are many others that are edible. And so as Jeff Dietrich, a leader of the Los Angeles Catholic Worker and a great interpreter of Scripture, as he wrote in many years of columns in their newspaper, The Catholic Agitator, wrote years ago, long before recent scholarship got onto this, that this kind of tree that we're seeing here looked to the poor edible from a distance. When they got up, it was disappointing. In other words, something that offered promise to be fruitful ended up being bitter and inedible. And Jeff suggests that's a symbol here as a substitute for the fig tree that was supposed to be the temple. And interestingly, in terms of narrative context, Luke does not have the story of the cursed fig tree that Mark and Matthew have. That's not in John either, but in the synoptic sense of entering into Jerusalem in this context and preparing to overturn the tables of the money changers, which John has back in chapter 2. So there's no great entry like there is in the synoptics leading all the way through the gospel till we get there near the end, as we're about to do here. That in contrast with the withered fig tree is a tree that would never bring good fruit. And of course that's in contrast with what we saw back in chapter 13, where there's a little parable about a fig tree that's not bearing fruit, and the manager of the fig tree says, "Let's put some manure around it and see if that helps, and if not, then we'll cut it down." So that is a symbol of the fruitlessness of the temple, right at the center of the chiasm. But this is something else. This is perhaps a symbol of the fact that there's no fruit because people like tax collectors have taken all the money. You can interpret that symbol any way you like. But he's climbing the tree because he, plainly Jesus, was going to pass that way. How he knows that, we don't know, although the crowd being there would certainly suggest that he's responding to the crowd. And so Zacchaeus is up the tree, and Jesus comes to the place. And as Verus notes below, a little chiasm in 5 to 10. I didn't set that out separately because it's not deeply important to our story as we see the pattern back over here, which is, I think, more of relevance than than this alleged chiasm. But there it is if that you find that helpful. So when Jesus came to the place, he looked up. What leads him to look? But the word anablepsis is looked again, which is what we saw 3 times in the previous story of the man when Jesus asked him, what do you want? He said, I want to see again, using that word. So Jesus looked again and said to him, the second image of seeing here, that Zacchaeus wanted to see who Jesus was, and Jesus looks up and calls him by name. Again, and I didn't note that doubling, but there it is too, the name twice. Zacchaeus, hurry and come down, spudos here, and only back in 2:16 when the shepherds were hurrying to share the news from the angels, and the next verse anywhere else in Luke, and not elsewhere in the Gospels, although it's a couple of times in Acts. So hurry and come down, I must, using dei, the word for divine necessity. So Jesus sees it as God is calling him to stay at your house, or literally to abide, meno. And that's more than just for a meal. That's abiding. In his sick notes, the main guest invites the host. But there's something about abide, a key word in the Gospel of John, and the ministry that my wife Sue and I have had for 2 decades now is abide in me from John 15, so we know that term very well. But here, a rare use of abide in Luke, we see it 7 times, in contrast to the many, many times in John, is suggesting some kind of lingering, some kind of more than just the meal. And notice that no meal is mentioned directly. At your house today. And we've seen Jesus at a house a number of times, in the house of a Pharisee and others, but now again at the house of a sinner. And so we see as we reach the part we'll stop on now, he hurried down, doing exactly what Jesus told him to do, and was happy or rejoiced to welcome him. And as Sick notes here, he reads this as a classic Roman satire of a rich person hosting a feast. And he says, as a rich man will host a feast, Zacchaeus may be enrolled in a rogues gallery with characters such as these various ones from Roman literature. And so for Luke's audience, that may well be that they're expecting to see a satire of someone like Trimalchio from Petronius, which is the classic one of you can put lipstick on a pig, but you can't make him a nobility, which is to say you can give someone from the low class money and he can have big banquets, but he's still a member of the low class, something that the elite could laugh at to preserve their sense of the social hierarchy that makes them superior to characters like that. But our story is not over, and once Jesus and Zacchaeus come together, we're going to see how many themes turn around in the last part of our story. So we'll see you for that next time. Bye-bye.